we do mean it in broader terms. So safety in either transport or construction, farming, whatever the industry, it's meant to apply in general terms. So just bear that in mind. And the idea is to focus on assessments. That's obviously our bread and butter at JVR. But really understand how individual differences can assist in predicting safety behaviors, but within a context. So there's obviously there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will, when it comes to assessments, whether it's how people use the assessments or don't use assessments. And that's what we want to be, that to be part of the conversation today for the most part. So it really is open. I'm going to give a bit of context in a second and maybe chat for 10, 15 minutes. But then the idea is that we ask our questions, we contribute where we feel we've got expertise. So please bear that in mind. I think the benefit of these kind of sessions is when we all kind of contribute and ask our questions. And I've given guys like Jakob and some of the other people that I mentioned kind of free reign to say the controversial things, that they don't believe certain things that I say, to call us out. But that's where the richness of the conversation lies, I think, for the most part. I'm not going to do an extensive kind of introduction to the guys that have joined us, Peter, Jakob, Lani, and Nana, but they do have extensive experience in this space, whether it's in private consulting or actually having worked in these kind of environments. So I'm really excited to see what they have to say for the most part. But let's kind of kick it off there. Let me give a bit of context. Can everyone still see my screen? If anyone can just give me a thanks, Peter.
Yep.
Great.
This is some stats that I came across. To be fair, it's US stats, but fatalities per 100,000 kind of full-time workers. And this is quite shocking if you see the trend from 2013, perhaps making a bit of progress in 1 or 2 years, but for the most part, it seems to be increasing. And 2022 was the worst year yet. They only really published this at the end of 2023, so it's a lagging indicator. But for the most part, it kind of gives us the trend, and it really is quite worrying, where you see these kind of incidents, and these are already fatalities. So forget about just the where people have become disabled by certain accidents, and this is just fatalities, and it's quite shocking. And for the most part, it is attributed to human error. Yes, there's other contextual factors that are accounted for, but one report that I came across said that it's 20% of the people that are accounting for 80% of the accidents and fatalities. So if we focus on that human error component today, that's gonna help us kind of get a bit granular and really think through how, from that perspective, we can contribute as psychologists, professionals in that space, etc. But I just wanted to kind of show that, because I thought it was quite a worrying trend. And for the most part, it's because, again, in the report, there's a focus on things like protective gear, your PPE, or policies and procedures, training. And those are all necessary components for a safe environment, as we know, but I don't think they're sufficient. And that's where assessments can add some value, knowing that there's more to it. But perhaps we've plucked all the low-hanging fruit, if you will, and need to focus on yes, maintaining those things, the training and whatnot, but also maybe trying some different things to bring that curve down slightly. Again, kind of just a high-level view of a report I read from PwC. This was from 2023. They interviewed all the CEOs and senior leaders in the mining industry. So bear that in mind. That is the context. Again, when we're talking about safety today, it's more broadly. But what I thought was, what was quite interesting is the insights that were shared in the report are the focus of the CEOs going into the next 5-10 years. And although there was various things that were mentioned, like, let's say, technology, for example, and wanting to push certain technologies, there were many themes that were recurring, and I just focused on the safety components, selection. What I mean by that is, again, understanding who the right people are to bring on the bus, and screening out risk, and then that training components. So at a high level, you look at those 10 insights, and they touched on it in some way: safety, selection, and training quite frequently. And even if it's not represented that much, I think like the safety component, we know it's always a core metric for these industries. But the importance of it is sometimes kind of clouded by maybe it being not reflected as often as you would think. But it really is a core focus for these CEOs: safety. They mention the right people and skills training frequently in these various focus areas. And again, I thought it was just quite interesting to give the conversation a bit of focus, that they speak in the same language as what our focus, what our interests are when it comes to trying to predict safety performance. And I think we can add significant value from an assessment perspective. Now, again, just a brief or a quick picture to hang on to. I mentioned the human error and that component that we feel that from a personality perspective, from an individual differences framework a point of view, that can take us a long way in predicting who's going to be more prone to accidents. Again, another report that I read suggested that some people are 4 times as likely. This was in a very specific industry, but some people are 4 times as likely to cause accidents than others. And that speaks to this individual differences framework that I refer to often. I'll post in a second in the chat a blog article that we wrote at JVR recently about individual differences. And this this kind of highlights or unpacks some of the concepts that we'll chat about today. For the most part, I can't go into all the things or all the jargon that we might use, but that article might be quite helpful. But individual differences, for those that might not be aware, is just we differ on various constructs, from intelligence to various personality elements, like, let's say, rule following or conscientiousness. And some of these things are actually quite good predictors of whether the person is going to have a safety orientation, how those behaviors play out. So that's what I mean by an individual differences framework, is understanding these differences and how they potentially play out. That said, I think it speaks quite nicely, for example, the personality and the cognitive elements, to things like safety behaviors, how it predicts that, and how someone in training, for example, might get on top of complex information, how they might remember this and kind of enact the learnings. But I do realize that it happens within a context, although it might not be mentioned as much today. The environment is the constraint, right? It constrains people's expressions of their personality. And this could be safety climates, their perceptions of the safety focus in the mine, or whatever organization it might be, leadership, and the list is never ending. But to give kind of that focus today, we're going to be chatting about that individual differences component. And I might be wrong, and please, if someone else has a different opinion, there seems to have been a trend in the last 15 years. Yes, it goes back, selection using assessments, etc. But there seems to be a groundswell kind of building, and more businesses outside of safety are also using it. But it's becoming more and more popular. But at the same time, you're seeing this kind of tension with people questioning its validity. Does selecting or does kind of screening out people on personality help? Why do we still have problems when we're using these assessments? And that's kind of the bad and the ugly, I guess, of today's kind of conversation. And I'm going to be picking the brains of others just now why that might be the case. But it seems we have all the ingredients there. I love that this quote at the bottom: when you want something to eat, but all you have are ingredients. It's a bit of a kind of case of chicken and egg, or that we need to do something or put these together in ways that actually make a meaningful difference. But I've been blabbing for quite some time now. Let me kind of hand it over, and I want to open it up to everyone in the conversation before we perhaps get a bit more targeted. And please unmute, just because I can't see the chat like I'd want to. Colleagues, what are your views on an individual differences framework when it comes to safety behaviors, knowing that this is a really serious element of work performance, because it leads to fatalities, because it has impacts on families and communities. We really want to get it right. What are some of the contentious views? What are some of the highlights for you, if you do kind of think psychometrics makes a difference? Please just share your views.
So Andrew, maybe I'm going to start off. I think the one thing from an assessment and individual differences, I think in our context, being South Africans, which has always been contentious, is does cognitive ability cognitively predict safe performance? And I mean, that could be on all levels, but especially on lower levels. Let's call it the blue collar worker. And again, that has got obviously a legacy and historical component as well to that question. But if I mean, you show stats from the US Department of Labor, but that's what a question I want to maybe put on the table and ask some of the practitioners in the field. I've seen certain studies that indicate that it might differentiate between safe and unsafe performance. Then the next question is, what do we do if it does differentiate? Is it fair? Does it impact adversely to some legacy conditions in our country? So yeah, I think personality is always a nice one, but I think cognition is the contentious one that I'm always interested to see. What is the research saying? Where is the practical studies been done to actually give us that insight? Because I think from an assessment perspective, we as a country, we do a lot of assessments, to your point, and we as a country, and again, maybe just take my view, I'm of the opinion that we usually look at cognitive ability generally in psychometric assessments, whichever level. So my question is, does it make a significant difference in preventing fatalities or safety incidents at work?
It's a great place to start. Anyone want to contribute? Yes, please, Nicola. I know you've done research here.
Yeah. So I think, Peter, from I'm working from memory here, but I think the cognitive ability does predict, but only up to a point. So it's more from a sort of lower level, because it plays into judgment, right? So if we think about cognitive ability, it does play into how you make decisions and the quality of your decisions. But I consider myself to be a fairly intelligent person. If you put a four-cornered table in an empty room, I'm going to walk into it and bang my leg. I promise you, because I'm not very good at paying attention to my environment. And I think it kind of works like that. So so that from a sort of you need to have some level of being able to make good decisions when in a dangerous situation. But over and above that, I don't think it's as predictive.
If I can just add, and I do want to hear others' views. Some of the research suggests that it really also depends on the level. As we know, that cognitive ability in general terms, as you're going up the organization, medium complexity, higher complexity, then it really comes into its own in terms of fluid intelligence, things like dealing with complexity. And you mentioned, Nicola, about the decision-making components. Often at the lower levels, the environments are quite stringent in terms of the expectations. So there's not a lot of variation. You're not always thinking for yourself. So what we find there is not necessarily fluid intelligence adding a lot of value, but things like reaction times. You mentioned that proprioceptive kind of ability, being able to check your body in space. Those kind of abilities that are in a distal way related to cognition are going to be more important. But it's about getting specific, I think. And if there's any other colleagues that have a different view or want to add to that, please. Such an interesting area to focus on.
Just from my perspective, I think fluid intelligence and learning ability does play a role. You need to learn how to do the job. But I think a bigger predictor of that is the actual culture that the person is living in. If it's part of the culture to break the rules and they've been doing it 10 million times, they will probably do it again. And that forms part of the culture from top down and bottom up. And you also need to break that culture of not following the rules and doing something right. You might do it wrong for 5 times, and the 6th time there's a fatality because everything just aligned on that specific day. So as it plays an important component of the whole bigger picture, it is one component of it, of a bigger picture within an organization and the culture. Yeah. That's my point of view on it.
To touch on that, it's always interesting when the topic of conscientiousness is also raised, because that's this whole idea that, hey, so I have a pattern of behavior that's going to support actually sticking to rules. But if the rules in that particular culture, in that organization is, hey, we're pushing production, then conscientiousness in that particular case is most likely going to have negative impact. And that just gets back to this whole idea of when we're talking about assessment when it comes to safety behaviors, you need to understand the job, you need to understand the system in which this person is operating. So there's a recent example where we worked at a company, apologies, I'm going to go into some specifics, where they were introducing new board units at a factory, which basically is a production line, and this new unit was much, much more effective than the production lines they had previously, which also means that it's placing a much higher strain on the same teams that's operating it, just because of the rate and pace of change. And that gets me to another little pet peeve. Often when we see these studies saying, oh no, it's individual factors that's causing accidents. If you go and look at the actual results, it's because the rate of change and the pace and kind of stress and strain that's being placed on these people. So it's not just, hey, it's an individual factor. It is, what is the environment that this person is actually operating in? Now, long story short, because they recognize that this is going to place additional strain on these individuals, we want to make sure that we're actually going to make the optimal use of this new piece of technology that's coming in. They took the teams, put them through a full assessment battery, looking at both psychomotor, so your reaction speed, how quickly you can recover, as well as, let's say, general intelligence, but more abstract reasoning, as well as personality. And what was very useful with that is they actually use that to try and see, okay, how are we going to approach this? How are we going to set up our team, set up our leaders for success? So the moment that this board unit lands from overseas, while we're busy with the installation process, while we're training people on how to actually use it, how do we set up the environment in such a way to also support people actually being able to perform at their best here? And what was so interesting is the level of let's say, capability that was revealed on the abstract reasoning assessments. That gave us so much information on how long it's actually going to take these teams to adjust, how long it's actually going to take them to understand and react to this actual machine that's being put in. So instead of just screening people out, it was to understand, hey, this is almost the A team, this is the level of support and attention that you will need to give them as the leader. This is the, for lack of a better word, B team. They could still perform. It's going to take them longer. And it was interesting because that whole idea of it's going to take them longer, we saw that in training interventions. We saw that in the change management process. We saw that on the technical training. So oftentimes there is a bit of resistance to assessments because we don't always see the direct results where people will say, hey, sorry, don't want to ramble, but hey, we're doing these assessments, it's predicting certain things, but we're not necessarily seeing this in the workplace. You see that when you're not approaching this in an integrated manner, when you're not linking the assessment to a broader process, because just testing someone, that's where your work starts. That doesn't mean you've actually done anything. So long answer, but I hope that as an example serves to illustrate.
Well, we basically can wrap up there because that's the whole idea is that integrated approach. But thanks for mentioning that. Is Nana on the line?
No, we're not seeing her.
Thanks, Keith. I would have loved to have got her take on how the business does integrate assessments from her perspective.
Andrew, I just want
Peter,
to run back to Lani's point on the culture, which I think it's very important. And I've also had examples of where that's really playing a contributing factor. So Lani, my question actually to you is from an assessment perspective, how do you determine if there's a fit? Let's say we're talking about individual differences. What is a process to identify the individual fit against a specific culture on that level?
What I've been involved in, and I've been more involved in development type of assessments, not necessarily recruitment. I've limited experience in the recruitment space. However, but from a development perspective, we once did a psychometric assessment in a company, and we used the results after a fatality occurred. So we looked on the risk from your production manager straight down to your minor level to see if there's any correlations if you looked on it risk on risk. And there definitely was. For example, the production manager had a bit of anger management issues. There was an external locus of control. They couldn't handle their stress very well. And that spiraled down to the section manager on the lower level. He put pressure on the mine overseer. The mine overseer has got an external locus of control, so he's blaming everybody. And that mine overseer is struggling to communicate. So it's pushing it down to the shift supervisor, also external locus of control, struggling to handle emotional communication. So he couldn't handle that pressure being put on him, and it spiraled down to the miner. So there's a whole cycle of events that actually occurred from top to bottom. That's why I'm also saying we need to look at the system holistically when we look at these assessments in predicting what is going to happen. And I do believe assessments would give us, we focus a lot on lagging indicators after the fact when these things happen. Assessment gives us the leading indicator to say, listen, this is coming and this is going to happen. We've got a production manager that's prone to be very angry. That is a risk factor from a personality perspective, or if he blames everybody around him. And from research, and locus of control is quite a big predictor of safety and safety performance. There's a blame, and what we typically see in South Africa is quite a big blame culture. And Andrew showed the statistics of overseas, but within the South African context, if we look at fatalities, we've been hovering at about 60 fatalities per year from 1990 or 2004 for the past 10 years. So it hasn't really changed much. So my call is that we need to start focusing on something different. And I do believe a part of this is assessment, more focusing on the human factor within the industry, because it's been very stable. Though there's so much work the DMRs put in on the technical side and putting technical controls in place, we need to start looking at the people and the human behavior behind it. More concerted effort. There is effort put in, but I think we can do it better. Please.
Peter, Jacob, do you think assessments can be used to plug that culture issue? And how? I know, Jacob, you mentioned the integrator approach, and probably be coming back to that a number of times, but do both of you think the assessments could play a role in that culture space? Do we hire for culture fit, or do we hire for culture add-on, or whatever you want to call it? Maybe start with you, Jacob. You're big on my screen there.
Yeah, no, I'm going to deflect the question first because there's something I quickly want to touch on, and then I'll respond to that. The statements that nothing's changing when it comes to fatalities, I think is a little bit dubious. So I understand the graph that we showed at the beginning. It showed from 2013, it's a little bit flat. If you zoom out a bit, what you typically see in South Africa as well as overseas is there is a downward trend. But what usually happens is it goes down a bit, it reaches a plateau for a few years, down a bit, maybe up a bit. So it's typically this kind of downward plateau. And in those plateau periods is where a lot of interesting things happen, because companies tend to throw almost anything against the wall to try and see what sticks. Fact of the matter is, accidents happen when controls fail. Now, this is not just a hazard and risk management way of looking at it. Your controls sits at organizational level, at team level, system level, as well as individual level. So when we make statements such as, okay, we keep on blaming right down the line because an individual has a certain locus of control. That's one way of viewing it. And you measure that person, most likely you are going to see, hey, there's a certain level of locus of control at this individual. The question is then still, did they enter the company with that? Or was that something that has been created in the company over time? Because that brings us straight to, do you hire or not? And for me, it's you decide on the culture that you want to achieve, and you try and align your systems, your processes, your skills, your competencies to that. And the individuals that are already in the organization, you give them every possible opportunity and support to align with this desired culture. And you need to make sure that that's the culture that you actually want and your culture that you actually need. Hiring, you take that approach as well. This is the type of people that we need to bring into the culture. And if you've given every single possible opportunity and support for a person to align to that culture and it's still not happening, then you need to have a real conversation to say, hey, look, thank you, but maybe this is not the place for you. Maybe there's another organization for you. The key thing is you need to be very, very specific on what's the culture that you need to achieve in that specific sector, so that it doesn't just become a cop-out, this is not a person that I'm agreeing with, or this is not the type of individual that we want. Fact of the matter is as well, if you sit with an organization where you have, for example, a few forklift drivers, they've been there for years and years and years, they are not performing on that particular piece of equipment, then perhaps culture discussion is not the best discussion. Try and get as close to as possible as to what is this person actually doing and what's the key risks in that particular job that they're doing. And when you take that approach and see what's the support that we can give that person to do their job and do it safely, that's where you're also showing what's the type of culture that you're actually building in the organization. Too often we see lovely posters on a wall, lovely statements, but how are we actually acting? That's where you show your real culture.
Peter, do you wanna add something?
I think the question, thanks, Jacob. I think the question from a assessment perspective, my experience is that although to Lonnie's point, I think everyone would agree in a room that culture is an enabling factor. It's a factor that possibly detracts from unsafe behavior. But when we come to an assessment perspective, I don't know if we've got the patience to sort of assess for culture and not jump to, we want to make sure that the next accident doesn't happen. Because I think from a culture view, it's definitely not as a quick win as, or, you know, we want to just identify if this guy tomorrow is going to pitch up at work and be reckless. And how can you quickly identify that to us? So maybe to Jacob's point then, if we say this person has come into this organization with a skewed values fit, what do we do with that? Do we have a plan? If we've decided on what that culture is, do we have a plan to remove that potential risk from the environment? So I think my summary statement is, I don't think we are, or where I've been involved, there's maturity in assessing for a values fit as an in-selection process, just because it's perceived as not as immediate, although we from a macro perspective understand it, that's probably going to sustain it. But now the question is from a contributing factor, where does that trump? You know, just the immediate cognitive risk or psychomotor risk or the values fit. Then again comes to the trainability factor. What is then the best way to address if there's any gaps, or to rectify if there's any flaws that you, to Lonnie's point, that you see as leading factors as opposed to lagging?
Absolutely. I know this is a bit of an unfair question for you three and for everyone on the call, because we know it's a systems-based approach. There's so many levers we could potentially pull, some more important than others. But is there one thing that these organizations, that these high-risk environments or industries can be focusing on further upstream to ensure that we kind of maintain that plateau or decrease those accidents? Is there such a thing, or what is the most important factor in the view of everyone on the call? Perhaps starting with those three, Lonnie and Peter and Jacob. what is the most important factor in predicting safety performance, if at all? Lonnie, can I start with you? Can I put you on the spot? I think I know
You
what you're
can
going
put
to
me
say,
on
but
spot.
I know it's an unfair question, but if you have no answer or don't want to answer, fair enough.
First of all, it goes back to where does all these fatalities, incidents, accidents start? So if you review the fatalities that happened, and I've been going through it quite extensively, seeing where it starts and the incident descriptions by the DMR. And a lot of it is hazard identification. People do not identify hazards correctly. There's some form of, I don't want to say failure, but leadership thing that has happened in that continuum. And that would be, for me, a focus. We need to get people more aware of the hazards that they are going on. And we've done a lot of work from systems perspective. But does systems change behavior? A lot of times, no, it does not necessarily change behavior. It can only change it up to a point. And we went and we've systemized VFLs, for example, visible felt leadership as an example. And in an ideal world, at the beginning, you want to systemize it until it's become part of the culture. And that's to my second point, where as leaders, we do not just have to do management walkabouts. We actually need to do visible felt leadership, which links back to coaching. And what is found in those PTOs, VFLs, a lot of times PTO sits in an office somewhere with a training, we don't look at it. We need to go back and look at that, because that then becomes a leading indicator, and we should do something about it. So that's just part of my perspective on that question. It's saying we need to go out, and the people need to actually do walkabouts, do it in a visible felt way, have a coaching style and a coaching approach. One of my mentors, who's a retired senior team manager, he said, one of the big things, if we can only change that, is to get people to start coaching each other on the ground, having those hard discussions, not screaming and shouting, but actually talking to each other and creating a space that's psychologically safe. Without true psychological safety, you'll never achieve proper physical safety. The two are very, very much interlinked with each other. And if we want to look at recruitment, we need to look at how can we create a psychologically safe space for people to report near misses, to speak up about things going on within their environment. So yes.
Thanks, Lonnie. Gents, any silver bullets? Or more important antecedents, if you will. And Jacob, again, I know you're going to bang on about the system and the culture. So if you want to restate that, please go ahead. But if there's others that you haven't mentioned.
Look, I bang on about that because there's no single silver bullet. It's not just because that's also the area in which we operate, so full disclosure there. But let's take a few specific examples again. If you go to a company, you see, okay, they're not doing their visible felt leaderships, or the risk assessments is piling up in the office. Yes, that happens. Why is that happening? Because if you just look at this company on paper, hey, they have risk assessments in place, they have a system in place. Fact of the matter is, if that thing's only there on paper, it's not being used. It's not being used appropriately. In another mine, you will walk around, you see there's a lot of incidents happening again because of human error. You go underground, and you see, okay, even though people know they're not supposed to walk against this one wall, the rest of the passageway is literally up to my waist deep in mud, and I'm a tall oak. Where else is this oak going to walk except on the sides? So you know the risk. I know I'm not supposed to do it. What other alternative do I have? Those are very different solutions to those very different problems, which all relate to safety and safety performance. So we can sit here and we can have, what is the one approach, even asking the question of individual differences and how can we use this to improve. That's limiting the way that we view a very complex problem. And the way that you deal with a very complex problem is you understand how is it operating within that specific context. And again, we like to approach that with an organizational development and assessment view. There's other views as well. Neuroscience really helps a lot as well, but there is no single silver bullet. And I feel that we are looking for an easy way out where it rests on all of our shoulders as people who are well-trained, have our psychological hat on, but who are also well-trained when it comes to scientific reasoning to figure out what is going to be that 20% that makes the biggest difference at this particular area.
Yeah, definitely a nuanced approach. So thanks for mentioning it again. I hope that's not the message that's coming from my side, that it's all about the assessments, because again, I know it's these are complex things, and it's just one tool in the kit, if you will. And I did mention it was an unfair question, but I just love to put people on the spot and see if they do think there's something that accounts for the like the most variance in this kind of performance. So correct me if I'm wrong, Jakob, I'm hearing from you, context is really important, understanding the problems, and then bespoke solutions to what may be an issue. Lani was mentioning leadership's particularly important, and perhaps even culture, things like coaching and being there for one another, kind of taking responsibility for the other, if you will. Peter, I don't know if you have a contribution there.
Not specifically to your question, but as Jakob and Jannie was talking, so Jakob, if we envision that there's a need to address safety performance, to decrease incidents, I mean, what I'm hearing is there's multiple stakeholders that needs to work together. So even if you've got the best tool or the best and your functional area, you need to partner with other functional specialists, and to me, that may be also, I think what you're alluding to, that may be also lacking. So are we willing to partner with let's say with a mine captain or with a shift boss, and also create a collaborative approach to address it, because we are blinded. I agree with you in terms of we come with a science view, we understand human behavior to a certain degree, but there's practical elements there. So from a solution perspective, do we sit together and say, listen, what do you bring to the table? How do you view this? And from that sort of interdisciplinary, even sort of create a new model or framework of thinking, as opposed to overimposing. Okay, we all will agree, if you've got 10 people in the room, 9 will say there needs to be some sort of evaluation, whatever everyone will call it, but the way we get there might not be the way that we sort of see it traditionally.
There we go. What would be amazing if you can sit with people who have various different backgrounds, someone who has a engineering approach, someone who has an assessment approach, someone who has a very specific ethics and risk management approach. And you almost say, this is our situation, this is what we're struggling with. What's a differential kind of diagnosis that we can go in and try and solve this problem for? The key principle that I really try to hammer on is, how do we get as close as possible to this particular thing that we're trying to address? So if there's a hole on the ground, this thing is a hazard. Look, we can coach people, we can stand there and select people who are going to be vigilant, or you can just actually borrow it off and solve that problem. Now, we can't do that with every single hazard. But how do we get as close as possible to this thing that we're trying to solve, to this thing that we're trying to address, and handle it in that manner?
So if we take that approach, sorry, Andrew, and we say, let's say there's a hole that can't be fixed, or it can't be the risk can't be taken away. Do you think that our assessment constructs, or how we view, for example, that hole, is sufficient to solve that problem, or we need to re-engineer it from the other way around and saying that hole as a problem need to sort of advise the assessment approach, the assessment selection, the assessment measurement methodology, as opposed to now looking for an assessment on the shelf that predicts, will I look where I walk? Will I read the instructions? From that perspective. So is there also a way that, and I mean, what I'm hearing between you and Lani is there's, let's say, a certain percentage of risks that we can capture through documentation, through SOPs, through hazard identification, through protocols, but we still leaving with a sort of a void that is unexplained, that we sort of, what I'm taking from this session, that we actually try to point our finger on.
Is it directed at Jacob, Peter?
Yeah, maybe just as a Lonnie, you've got a
Okay, I see Lonnie unmuted, so I know she also wants to jump in. Whether it's a case of doing it almost bespoke or selecting something off the shelf, it's again what's going to be fit for purpose. If there's something on the shelf that is going to get you very close to what you're trying to understand, and it's cost effective, all of the other requirements and pressures that's on us when we're actually operating in industry to see, okay, what is the way that we can address this in the most efficient possible manner? You go through that process, but the big thing is test. Is this working? Is it actually make a difference? And when it's not working, why is it not working? The thing that I do see that's a bit concerning when it comes to assessments, and this is across the board, it's not just psychometric, it is competency based, it's even going into culture diagnostics, is we often point one assessment to another one and say, hey, these two different assessments correlate very nicely with each other. What we're seeing the less of is, okay, what's the actual difference that this is making to criterion information, criteria data that we're getting from companies? And the big reason for that is the safety data that's coming from companies when it comes to anything that's more predictive, that's not lagging, is very often not very reliable. There's reasons for that. This whole idea of having a blameless culture, as useful as that is, it also means that we often measure safety performance at a team level. So you're not exactly sure what individual dynamics is having an impact on the safety performance of that particular team or that particular section. So when it comes to how do we really figure out what's the correlation, what's the implications of various different assessments and various different constructs, the one area where a lot more work is required is getting accurate information on, I often say, get as close as possible to the outcome that you want, on not just safety, but safe performance, safe production, because you don't just want safety, you want safety as a portion of something that's being achieved. If I build a chair and I kill one of my colleagues while I'm doing it, well, you didn't really reach the goal. You want to build something, or you want to produce tons without killing people. You want to make sure that that is one and the same thing. It's a way of operating, a way of doing.
Great point about just because there's an absence of accidents or industries doesn't mean it's a safe work environment. Lonnie, did you want to add there before I open it up to the other people on the call?
I also just think that we need to, there's a lot of things that the companies are doing. I've been involved in fatality investigations and so forth, where we actually have set a multidisciplinary team and we have looked at everything and looking at what are we learning from this incident. And it should be, as Jacob said, a more integrated and holistic approach to that. And also from that learnings, we need to take that to an assessment perspective into the recruitment and the development. But what I've sometimes seen is we assess, but then it starts off at the recruitment portion where we don't use that assessments in their succession planning and the development of that person. And that is actually a huge gap. We shouldn't just assess to recruit. We should use that assessment throughout that employee's life cycle, and not just at one point. And then also, if things go wrong, I think there's a big place for recognition and discipline within the organization. Good behavior, recognize bad behavior, discipline. And people sometimes shy away from the discipline aspect of this and saying, this is wrong, we are not going to do it. And in my experience in one of the fatal investigation, it was a culture that was created over years when we looked at it from the human side. It wasn't just that day this thing happened. It happened over a period of time, and there should be a stop to that where people are looking more, and from the neuro perspective, being more situationally aware. That's what they train pilots on, for example. Forms a big part of pilot training, and we should focus more on that and not just, I've done my SLAM, I've done my risk assessment, and sometimes they sit and do it in the change house. And it will not be effective then. Safety should really be something that comes from the heart and a caring perspective, not just controlling. And we need to get the balance between the compliance and the control portion right with the caring portion as well. We need to create a balance in that. And that's where assessments to show the care comes in very nicely. Yeah, just my portion on it.
Thanks. I do want to open it up to some questions. I know we've gone back and forth in circles to some extent. Is there anyone else? Because I know there's Dr. Milan on the call and others that no doubt have some good takes or even questions. Does anyone want to unmute themselves or put a question in the chat for some of the guys on the call? Did Nana ever join us? I'd love to get her take as well.
I don't think so.
Okay. Thanks, Andrea. So it all seems somewhat what's the word? Not discouraging, but because it is so complex, it's almost like, how do we unravel this this mess? And I think that's where we're kind of having a framework and building blocks does become particularly useful, and looking at what's in our toolbox and checking that we're using everything to its fullest and to our best advantage, like assessments, but realizing that these things happen within a text. There was one study, and I mentioned it in the article, that our blog article about individual differences. It was a meta-analysis where they did look at the predictive validities or how much of personality accounts for variance and performance. And I mean, the debates have been ongoing, and they will be in perpetuity. I think it's not so much the magnitude, or not so much if they do predict these things, but rather the magnitude. But this meta-analysis was really useful, and it was interesting because they didn't only look at personality and get quite granular there. They did look at perceptions of safety culture, so safety climates, and it was a big predictor. So just what is the individual's kind of view of how leadership deals with these things, how the organization in general facilitates safety, and that was a big predictor. But personality did predict things over and above that. So safety behaviors over and above the general culture or the perception of the culture, which I thought was really interesting, and in various ways. So conscientiousness, if you're thinking about your big five, they all play a role. Higher neuroticism, problematic. Extroversion, higher extroversion, also problematic because of the distractibility, and it varied depending on the industry. But the one point that I thought was so interesting in terms of how they might use assessments for wider kind of system interventions was there's something called purposive work theory from Barrick, and it speaks about how we all we're all motivated by inherent goals, if you will, but that the difference in how important those goals are to us is predicted by personality. So they looked at goals like communalism, autonomy, status, and what they found in this particular meta-analysis was things like altruism, strangely enough, were really good predictors of things like safety participation. So there's more contextual performance factors where it's what those helping behaviors, how do I go over and above what's required of me, and also having the focus on other people in the business where I'm not just focused on what I'm doing and making sure that I'm operating within the lines. It's having a wider view. And what they used some of this assessment data for was, or at least the suggestion was, a lot of the messaging within an organization is about you and what you're doing and what you're not paying attention to or are paying attention to, et cetera, et cetera. So they said, okay, based on some of these findings about things like altruism, et cetera, being quite good predictors, maybe change the messaging within the environment to be less about you, and now are you your brother's keeper kind of thing. Like look out for the person next to you. I'm not doing the finding or the suggestion justice, but I just really appreciated the fact that they looked at personality, but in the context of other predictors like climate, perceptions of safety, which was important, but personality added incremental validity over and above that. But now using that finding to, what are the kind of interventions that we can do now? What are we not kind of leveraging? And it speaks to that integrated approach. I think you mentioned, Jakob, about using the assessments, and not just about the assessments or the individual differences, but using it to understand culture. And I just thought that was really encouraging, because I don't think that assessments are used effectively. That data is going to be quite useful, not just in selection, but Lani, to your point about development, but then also understanding and those interventions at a wider systems kind of perspective, particularly important. I don't know if anyone has any final thoughts before we wrap up. Nicola, Brandon.
Yeah, I have a thought. Many thoughts, but look, we've been involved in research with your Section 54 shutdowns and post fatality interviews of everyone in the mine, kind of initiatives as well. And even in mines where the culture is very much, I'm a brother's keeper, get me home safe to my family, and so on. So it is such a complex beast. I think Jakob said that very eloquently, that it's never only one factor. But I think we have to continue to do research, and research in this, not only in mining. The safety industry is much wider than that, but it's so difficult to do research on the safety, particularly because, and it's as Jakob said as well, the things that we're measuring with regards to what is safety behavior are not reliable. They're not captured consistently. They're not available. And I think part of the answer there is, what are your metrics? How do we make sure that we get consistent measures from the business so that we can also understand how it is that we can predict those things going forward? So we could have the best assessments predicting personality, cognitive, whatever the case may be, but you can't predict something that's not predictable. So it's how do we make sure that we're measuring the right things for all of the different levels of controls that they could have in the organization? Organizational controls, team controls, your individual control should be your sort of personality makeup to an extent, but what are those? And I think that's also where the conversation should be focused.
Just a comment, we've spoken a lot about personality and cognitive ability, but we must always remember the state that that individual is in as well. Things like burnout does contribute, employee engagement. So we need to look at those. It's a complex beast, and that also plays a big role. If that person is burned out, going underground, there is a risk to it.
Yeah, and that's what you're also seeing more and more from the neuroscience literature is you're not just this brain floating in a vat. What you've had to eat is going to have an effect on your mood, it's going to have an effect on your state, it's going to have an effect on your level of risk-taking that particular day. And yeah, just want to also affirm what Nicola was saying of, Andrew, you asked for a silver bullet. The silver bullet is, please don't switch off this thing between your ears. When you are working at that particular organization, you're trying to figure out what the arse is going on here. Sorry for my language. Really make sure that you understand it. Make sure that you're going into detail. Make sure that when you're looking at, for example, incident rates, how is that defined? If that, like it is in many organizations, is just defined as, okay, nothing went wrong, then how are you going to use that to actually predict that anything we did cause no accidents to happen? And if you also go a bit deeper and you have a look at, okay, what are we actually incentivizing, literally paying people to do? And in some organizations, it is a case that we are incentivizing people not to report accidents because I get almost double my salary if no accidents take place. Okay, so that's a very skewed view of safety because it's literally just, hey, nothing happened. And if that is your definition of safety, give me a few leaders with scoring high on the dark triad, and I will give you fantastic safety performance in that particular organization.
Absolutely. I know some people have a hard finish at 12. Jakob, I know you need to jump just now. Thank you so much for the contribution. Is there anyone that Peter, I know I'm gonna give you some final words in a second. Anyone else that wants to share anything? You mentioned factors like sleeping and not eating. We had a client in the Middle East during Ramadan. People are not eating, and they're finding that this leads to not necessarily accidents, but sleeping on the job or just being a little bit disoriented because they haven't eaten. Like, all these factors are particularly important. Sorry, just it triggered something when you mentioned some of those kind of dispositional or day-to-day factors that go up and down that we need to account for. Peter, I think I'm going to give you the final word just because it's 12 o'clock, and then we're going to jump off. Thanks everyone, Jakob, Lani, Peter, for your contribution. But Peter, do you want to wrap it up for us or give some final thoughts?
No, I just enjoyed it very much. I realized how little I know about the subject, just to be, in a conversation with other people that see these things playing out. And I do think all of us are rooting for the same team here. I think what we bring to the table is a very human-centric view of how behavior works, and that is our key differentiator. But to Jakob and Lani's point, to be open to other parties, so listen, we need to address this because one life loss is one too many for all of us, and that should really be our driving motivation for this.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great place to leave it. I think we need to carry on this conversation and might have another one in the future. But again, thank you everyone. Thank you to the panel and Nicola for your contributions. Have a wonderful and safe afternoon. Cheers.
Thanks, Andrew.